The lights had dimmed long before the curtain ever truly fell on Marlon Brando's life. By the time he retreated into the shadows of his Beverly Hills home, the man who had once redefined cinema itself had become a ghost of contradictions, larger than life, yet shrinking into secrecy, surrounded by fame, yet strangely alone. In the final years, on more than one occasion, Brando had stunned the world with his candor. He was no stranger to shocking confessions, casually admitting in interviews what others would never dare. "I've had homosexual experiences, so what?" It was a simple sentence, but in the rigid confines of mid-century Hollywood, it was a thunderclap. "But there was only one who made me forget myself." The words hang heavy even now, decades after they were spoken. One man only. But who was he? For years, speculation has circled like vultures. James Dean, the doomed prince of rebellion, whose rumored bond with Brando fascinated generations. Wally Cox, the boyhood friend turned lifelong confidant, whose ashes Brando kept by his bedside. Both names have been spoken, written, whispered into the myth. And yet, Brando's own words pointed elsewhere. Not Dean, not Cox, someone else entirely. The clue lies in fragments, a fleeting collaboration, a friendship that burned quickly and then disappeared, a name that never made it into the gilded history of Hollywood but lived on, briefly, in Brando's fading breath. And there are whispers, too, of a letter written in Brando's own hand, delivered after his death, only to be seized by his family, locked away or destroyed before it could ever see the light. This is where our story begins, not in the bright lights of a streetcar named Desire or the power of The Godfather, but in the silences Brando left behind. Silences that suggest Hollywood's greatest actor may have spent his last days haunted not by the roles he played, but by the love he lost, and the truth that was never meant to be told. To understand the weight of Brando's confession, you have to remember who he was at the height of his reign. In the 1950s, Hollywood was built on fantasy, on icons carved out of celluloid and marketed as untouchable gods. Brando was more than just a star, he was a revolution. When he emerged in a streetcar named Desire, raw and magnetic, the screen itself seemed to bend around him. With On the Waterfront, he became the face of a new kind of acting, vulnerable, dangerous, and real. By the time he slipped into Don Corleone's skin in The Godfather, he had ascended to something beyond an actor. He was myth, flesh and shadow, masculinity itself redefined. Women wanted him. Men wanted to be him. He was Hollywood's greatest paradox, both the rebel and the crown. And yet, beneath that carefully manufactured image of virility, Brando was playing a role off-screen as well. Hollywood's golden age had no tolerance for nuance. The studios demanded their leading men be symbols, their private lives ironed flat into the glossy spreads of Life and Look magazines. Though it certainly did. It was a dismissal, a dare, a reminder that he was larger than their headlines. For Brando, Desire was not a box to be labeled or hidden. It was simply part of the human experience. But Hollywood was not ready for that honesty. To the public, Brando was the ultimate heterosexual rebel, the leather-jacketed heartthrob who changed acting forever. To those who knew him more intimately, the truth was far less simple. Every whispered story about his sexuality became a piece of the puzzle. But the puzzle was never complete, not until his final years. For decades, the mythology of Marlon Brando's love life has been a story in itself, a tangle of names, whispers, and half-truths that critics and fans alike have tried to decode. His magnetism was undeniable, and everyone seemed to want a piece of him. But somewhere in that endless constellation of lovers and rumors, a few stars burned brighter, leaving behind legacies of their own. James Dean was the first name to be etched into the lore. Two rebels, two icons of method acting, circling each other in an industry that wasn't built to contain them. Dean was electric, volatile, a flame destined to burn out too soon. Brando was older, already established. Dean supposedly wrote Brando letters, begging him to call, to meet, to acknowledge the pull between them. Whether Brando ever answered remains uncertain, but the fascination with their bond has never faded. Hollywood thrives on speculation, and the idea of its two most magnetic rebels entwined was too intoxicating to ignore. Then there was Wally Cox, The answer doesn't lie in the familiar names printed in gossip columns or immortalized in biographies. It lies somewhere else, in a story that was never told. In the final stretch of Marlon Brando's life, the glamour was long gone. The dazzling premieres, the adoring fans, the defiance that once lit up every stage and set, these had faded into the background, leaving behind a man struggling with failing health and the ghosts of a turbulent past. His days were quieter now, measured not in triumphs, but in reflections. And it was in those quiet hours that his most startling truth surfaced. Brando, never one to mince words. The statement lingered like smoke in the room, impossible to grasp, impossible to ignore. To those who heard it, it felt less like gossip and more like revelation, an admission that, for all his affairs, all his passions, only one had truly undone him. Naturally, speculation erupted. Surely he meant James Dean, the tragic starlet whose brief, blazing life intersected with Brando's in ways no one fully understood. But Brando dismissed the notion. Dean had been important, yes, but not the one. Then came the whispers of Wally Cox, the friend whose ashes Brando kept close as though tethered by something eternal. Yet when pressed, Brando shook his head. Cox was family, beloved, but not the one. So who was this man? Leaving behind nothing but a fragment of memory and a confession too fragile to withstand the weight of the world. For decades, Brando had reveled in contradictions. He was the rebel who cared deeply about justice, the lover of many who claimed no allegiance to monogamy, the artist who mocked Hollywood even as he collected its highest honors. But this was different. This was not rebellion or performance. This was surrender. A surrender to the memory of a man who, against all odds, had left the greatest actor of his time utterly undone. The story should have ended there, with a simple confession lost in the haze of Brando's final days. But it didn't, because somewhere, hidden in the ashes of his legacy, there was another clue. A letter, a name, a piece of truth so dangerous to the mythology of Marlon Brando that it was locked away, silenced before it could ever reach the light. The man Brando spoke of was no James Dean, no Wally Cox, no glittering star of the Golden Age. He was, instead, a writer, a quiet figure who spent more time in the margins of Hollywood than in its spotlight. His name has largely been erased from the histories. When Brando's career had hit one of its many crossroads, he was restless, unpredictable, drawn to projects that never seemed to find their footing. Somewhere in that turbulence, he crossed paths with a young screenwriter attached to a film that would never be made. The project collapsed before cameras ever rolled, yet the connection between Brando and this man lingered. Accounts from those who hovered at the edges of Brando's circle described their bond as immediate and consuming. The screenwriter was not glamorous, not the kind of companion Hollywood would pair with its reigning rebel. He was soft-spoken, thoughtful, a man who listened more than he talked. In Brando's world, loud, chaotic, filled with sycophants and critics, that silence must have been intoxicating. They were seen together only rarely, and even then, it was in shadows, late-night dinners. Few guessed it was anything more. But behind closed doors, their intimacy deepened, and Brando, so often guarded, so often in control, allowed himself to be vulnerable. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the writer was gone. His name slipped from credits. His career never took flight. Some whispered he had been blacklisted, others that he chose to walk away. But in an industry as ruthless as Hollywood, disappearances are rarely accidents. Projects dry up, reputations are quietly tarnished, opportunities vanish, whether by choice or by force. The writer's presence was scrubbed from the scene. For Brando, who collected lovers as easily as most collect memories, it might have been just another passing flame. And yet, decades later, at the end of his life, it was this man, this forgotten writer, whom Brando remembered. This was the man who made him forget himself, the one love that had seared itself into his very being, long after the rest had faded. Why, then, did history erase him? Was it simply the cruelty of an industry that devours its own? Or was there something more deliberate at work, an erasure fueled by power, by fear, by the unyielding need to protect the image of Hollywood's greatest rebel? The clues suggest the latter. The story of the vanished screenwriter might have remained little more than a rumor, a shadow whispered about in private circles, if not for one final piece of evidence, a letter. According to those who were closest to Brando, the actor left behind a handwritten note, tucked among his personal papers in the days leading up to his death. It was brief, almost fragmentary, but its words were unmistakable. In it, Brando spoke of a man, not Dean, not Cox, someone else entirely. He described him as the one who brought him peace. Damaging to what, though? To Brando's legacy as Hollywood's ultimate icon of masculinity? To the family's desire to protect him from tabloid exploitation? Or to the broader machinery of an industry still uncomfortable with rewriting its legends? There are whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, that at least one copy of the letter survived, passed quietly among confidants before disappearing again. Those who claim to have read it describe its tone as startlingly intimate, its mention of the screenwriter's name almost casual, as though Brando expected the world to know him, but the world did not. And when the family demanded the letter's destruction, the man's existence was effectively erased once more. Hollywood has long been an expert at this kind of erasure. In its golden age, studios kept entire departments dedicated to burying scandals, buying silence, and crafting narratives that suited their stars. Queer love, especially between men, was one of the easiest targets. It was easier to erase, to deny, to burn the evidence, than to allow it to stand against the myth they had built. And so, the letter became another casualty of that system. What should have been a key to understanding Brando's most profound confession was reduced to hearsay, locked behind closed doors, denied the chance to exist in the open. But like all secrets, it lingers. It lingers in the half-sentences Brando left behind. It lingers in the nervous laughter of those who refuse to comment. It lingers in the uncomfortable silence of an industry that would rather forget than face the truth. The truth is that Marlon Brando loved a man who never became a star. And Hollywood, in its relentless pursuit of control, made sure that man disappeared. Marlon Brando lived his life in contradictions. He was the rebel who became the establishment, the sex symbol who despised fame, the man who could never be contained yet longed for connection. And in the end, after decades of lovers, scandals, and speculation, he admitted that only one man had ever made him forget himself. But that man's name has been scrubbed from the record, his story lost in the shadows of Hollywood's machinery. Perhaps it was deliberate, a choice made to protect reputations and preserve myths. Perhaps it was simply the cruelty of time, erasing those who never claimed the spotlight. Either way, the result is the same. A love that once existed now survives only in whispers, in fragments, in a letter that may never be seen. What remains is the ache of the unknown. The thought that one of Hollywood's greatest legends spent his final days haunted not by his roles, but by the memory of a man the world was never meant to remember. And maybe that is the real tragedy. Not that Brando loved outside the lines, but that the story of that love was taken from him and from us. If these stories matter to you, if you believe that truth deserves a place in history, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is uncomfortable, then help us keep them alive. Subscribe to The Queer Truth, share this story, and tell us in the comments. Who do you believe was Marlon Brando's final love? Because until the truth is named, it remains a ghost.